Today's Easter Sunday. Easter Sunday is emblematic of spring, and it certainly feels like spring today. I kept the doors of the Zendo open for a while to get fresh air in, and I went to turn the heater on afterwards, and it was too warm. Didn't need to. Um, so spring. Let us not miss the spring. We each of us have a finite number of springs ahead. We don't have a limitless number of springs to look forward to. We have a finite number of springs to look forward to. Let us not waste them. Dogen Zenji in Shuogenzo Uji, The Time Being, says the following. He says, flowers do not bloom in spring. Flowers do not bloom in spring. Flowers blooming are themselves spring. So I would like to really encourage us to not miss spring, to remember that each of us has a finite number of springs. We don't have a limitless number of springs. Let us not waste spring. And I would propose as a koan, in Zen there's koans, which are kind of like probing questions that aren't meant to be solved rationally, but are to evoke deeper levels of being in rigorously inquiring into the meaning of the koan, the question. So I would offer Dogen's interesting statement. Flowers do not bloom in spring. Flowers blooming are themselves spring. That statement is a helpful hint on how to not waste spring. Flowers blooming in spring. Flowers do not bloom in spring. Flowers blooming are themselves spring. Indicates a different way of experiencing or perceiving time, a different way of embodying the moments of your experience. For some time I've been talking about or using the phrase stepping outside of the press of time is kind of like a metaphorical expression of the nature of effort, or endeavor might be a better word than effort. The nature of the endeavor in Zen practice, which indicates a different way of holding the fact of your being than a linear sense of time, than you're right now, to like summon up your being right now. And I think that notion of stepping outside of the linearity of time, the things that we've done in the past that we're proud of or regretful of, ashamed of, maybe the things in the future that we dread or that we want to accomplish, step outside of that press of time and be here now. That Dogen's statement, flowers do not bloom in spring, blossoms blooming are themselves spring, is another phrase that indicates the same shift of perspective, shift of perception. And let's not miss that. Let's not waste that. If you were sitting with us, you may have had the opportunity to see these words that I had in front of the camera. These words are traditionally brushed onto a instrument called the Han. In Zen temples, there's this instrument called the Han, which is a large wooden board, usually thick, anywhere from 3 to 5 inches thick and about yay big. It's struck with a wooden mallet, and this instrument is used to call practitioners to the zendo in the morning. And there's a pattern of signals that lasts for 15 minutes. And the pattern indicates how soon before Zazen officially starts. And you hear it early in the morning before the sun is even up. Something like that. There's more pattern, more articulations of the pattern. And that sound evokes a certain call. And the nature of that call is what's inscribed on the Han. And it's wake up. Life is transient, swiftly passing. Be aware of the great matter of birth and death. Don't waste time. I'll say that again after the motorcycle passes. Easter Sunday is Motorcycle Day on Main Street. Wake up. Life is transient, swiftly passing. Be aware of the great matter of birth and death. Don't waste time. So the GM, not General Motors, the GM, the great matter, that's a phrase that you will encounter in Zen literature all over the place. That, Zen practitioners were trying to penetrate the great matter, trying to actualize within their living the great matter. And the great matter is a truncated form of the great matter of birth and death. Birth and death is the great matter. Birth and death. The nature of birth, life, the nature of death was to be contemplated, was to be penetrated, to where you live life, you live death, you live cognizant. Cognizant is not quite the right word, although cognizance of mortality is necessary, but something more visceral. You live intimate with death, your death. That you can't live unless you're intimate with your death. And, that's a philosophical concept, but the point is to actually live that way. That was important to penetrate the great matter of birth and death. It's a fact, maybe. It's a fact. And that fact was the fact of death, of actually being conscious, live consciously. Living consciously requires consciousness of mortality, has been a theme in Buddha Dharma since the early days. In the Pali Canon, the Buddha would give guided meditations on decay and death, and he would recommend that the monks contemplate death, the fact that they were going to die, the fact that death is a fact. He would recommend that monks meditate in cemeteries, charnel grounds. A charnel ground is not quite a cemetery, because in a charnel ground they don't bury the bodies; they leave them on the surface, and that's a great opportunity. The Buddha says, "Go meditate on those bodies. Get it in through your skull that death is real. Stop running away from it." Considered very important. And a little anecdote that Tenshin Reb Anderson got himself into trouble some time ago because he was walking or jogging through Golden Gate Park, and he came across a dead body. And in his zeal, he did not think to himself, gee, I should go tell the police about this. No, in his zeal, he says, gee, I should come back here and meditate with this corpse. You know, that violates social convention, but what is social convention compared to the great matter of birth and death? You know, he was a younger man, had a lot of zeal for Zen practice, and so he made the decision to sit with the corpse rather than report it to the police. And this is, you know, this is well known. In fact, he relates this story with some expression of regret in Being Upright, his book on the Bodhisattva precepts. But that's a modern example of the practice of, you know, really finding a way to realize the great matter of birth and death, not just intellectualize it, but to actually live it, to live it. And Zen Master Ikkyu, I forget what time frame. I think he was after Dogen. He was like a contemporary of Ryokan, I think. So that would place him around the 17th century, I think. Don't hold me to that. But Ikkyu had this practice of taking a skull and walking into town and showing it to people. Say, hey, see this? This is going to be you someday. Look, this is going to be you. You know, get over it. Get with it. And so it's, you know, confronting head on the actual fact of our transiency, of our mortality, is a key element in Buddhist practice, and especially in Zen, you know, but not exclusively Zen, not relegated solely to Zen. So I've been reading this book. I've started reading this book by Ernest Becker, the Pulitzer Prize-winning book called The Denial of Death. And you know, death provokes anxiety. The fact of death provokes anxiety. And a lot of the psyche develops in response to that anxiety, to cover it, to resolve it. And so far, Becker's book is somewhat bleak. And the other book that I've read and I'm rereading by David Loy, Lack and Transcendence, pardon me. He also says that, you know, that Becker's outlook is, from one perspective, maybe kind of bleak. He says that the psyche cannot tolerate coming face to face with the fact of its mortality, and that we're relegated to choices between benign or malignant forms of avoidance, and that a lot of our formation in childhood, a lot of our cultural values are saturated with evasions of the anxiety of the fact of, you know, our death. And we engage in immortality projects, you know, some sort of symbolic immortality, you know, where, you know, we read a book that will outlast us, or we have progeny, children that will outlast us, you know, fame, you know, wealth. That's some way of symbolically leaving our mark so that we won't completely disappear. And then sometimes these are relatively benign. You know, they allow a person to not live in a perpetual state of anxiety, which Becker seems to say is ultimately necessary because the psyche would disintegrate. Psychosis would be the result if we lived palpably with the fact of our death. And but sometimes they get, psychopathological, and they cause psychosis and neurosis. The various strategies are maladaptive. Um, so uh, another psychologist, I think he's actually a doctor or psychiatrist, I'm not sure. Irvin Yalom wrote the book Existential Psychotherapy, and he's less bleak. He acknowledges the impact that the denial of mortality has on the psyche, and he's concerned about it. Um, so here's something that he says about the terror of death. I'm just checking my notes here. He says, the terror of death is ubiquitous and of such magnitude that a considerable portion of one's energy is consumed in the denial of death. There's the rub. The anxiety, turning from death, trying to distract ourselves to avoid living the reality of our death, consumes a considerable portion of one's life energy. Death transcendence is a major motif in human experience, from the most deeply personal internal phenomena, our defenses, our motivations, our dreams and nightmares, to the most public macro societal structures, our monuments, theologies, ideologies, slumber ceremonies, embalmings, our stretch into space exploration. Indeed, our entire way of life, our filling time. Let's waste time. The opposite of what the Han says. Let's waste time. Let's fill up our time with distraction. That's what he's getting at. Our addiction to diversions. He says what I just said for him. Our unfaltering belief in the myth of progress is another way of denying death. Our drive to get ahead, our yearning for lasting fame. So that's just one paragraph about death anxiety, an influential determinant of human experience and behavior. And he goes on, but that gives you a flavor of the problem, right? That the denial of death consumes a considerable portion of one's life energy. The denial of death consumes a lot of energy, which begs the question: if we didn't consume that energy in denying death, where would it go? What would it do? What kind of energetic experience of living might we have? So he tells some tales of people who have had brief near-death encounters, and what their experience was like. And this person there was interviewers with 6 of the 10 would-be suicides who leaped from the Golden Gate Bridge and survived. And these stories indicate that as a result of their leap into death, they're facing death and trying to commit suicide, these 6 had changed their views of life. One reported, "My will to live has taken over. There is a benevolent God in heaven who permeates all things in the universe." Another, "We're all members of the Godhead, the great God humanity." Another, "I have a strong life drive now. My whole life is reborn. I have broken out of the old pathways. I can now sense other people's existence." Another, "I feel I love God now and wish to do something for others." Another, "I was refilled with a new hope and purpose in being alive. It's beyond most people's comprehension. I appreciate the miracle of life, like watching a bird fly. Everything is more meaningful when you come close to losing it. I experienced a feeling of unity with all things and a oneness with all people. After my psychic rebirth, I also feel for everyone's pain. Everything was clear and bright. So those are people who tried to commit suicide, jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge, but survived, and they were grateful. And having actually embraced death and failed, tried to embrace death and failed, something changed within them. Their perception of what it meant to be alive changed. Okay, and here's a patient who had kidney failure. It was brought extremely close to death. Uh, After a long period of time on renal dialysis, the patient had a successful transplant and re-entered life with a sense of both physical and psychological rebirth. She describes her experience. Actually, the only way I can describe myself is I think of myself as having lived two lives. I even call them the first and the second Kathy. The first Kathy died during dialysis. She could not make it long in the face of death. She could not make it long in the face of death. A second Kathy had to be born. This is the Kathy that was born in the midst of death. The first Kathy was a frivolous kid. She lived only 1 minute at a time. And I would parenthetically say, and not in a good way. She quibbled about cold food in the cafeteria, about the boredom of surgical nursing lectures, about the unfairness of her parents. Her goal in life was to have fun on the weekends. The future was far away and of little concern. She lived for trivia only. But the second Kathy, that's me now. I am infatuated with life. Look at the beauty in the sky. It's gorgeously blue. I go into a flower garden. Every flower takes on such fabulous colors that I am dazzled by the beauty. One thing I do know, had I remained my first Kathy, I would have played away my whole life, frittered my whole life. And I would never have known what the real joy of living was all about. I had to face death eyeball to eyeball before I could live. I had to die in order to live. So, Yalom offers a perspective that if we can somehow integrate, and these are people whose circumstances compel them to integrate their mortality into their conscious awareness, the way in which they actually took in life. They took in life in a different way, a way that required awareness of death. So this is why, we say awake. Wake up. Life is transient, swiftly passing. Be aware of the great matter of birth and death. Don't waste time. In Buddha Dharma, dukkha, the fundamental condition of suffering, dukkha is usually translated as suffering. Not a very good word to translate dukkha. The etymology I've gone into before. I'll review it real quickly. The ka is the hole in a wheel for the axle on a cart. So you have a wheel made out of wood. Back then, I would imagine. And in the center of the wheel, there's a hole that you put on the axle. That's a ka. And du means bad or imperfect or flawed. So dukkha, the etymology means a hole, an axle hole that is imperfect, and so the writing is rough. So that's the etymology of the word. More precisely, dissatisfaction, dis-ease would be fit more precisely than the word suffering, because suffering can mean a lot of things. When we die, we may suffer pain, but they may not be dukkha. If we somehow if we can practice equanimity in the midst of the sensations of pain, either pain, like right now my left knee's hurting a tiny bit, but but I have no dukkha because, I'm not, I'm rolling smoothly with it. I'm not fighting it. And later I might uncross my legs, but right now I have pain, but I don't have dukkha because the sensation isn't causing a rough ride. You know, it's not compromising equanimity. So the word dukkha, suffering, is too generalized. Dis-ease, dissatisfaction comes closer. Anxiety is pretty good. Um, in David Lloyd's book, Lack and Transcendence, this sense of anxiety, this sense, a sense of lack, that something's not quite right, uh, is dukkha. And dukkha is born from a fundamental ignorance. The fundamental ignorance of the nature of things, basically anicca and anatta, which is transience and lack of a inherently perduring self. So we want to live forever and we can't. We have this ego that we want to be real and it isn't. And so we try to evade these realities on some very, very, like cellular levels. It's not even conscious that we grasp at a self that's not really there, that we're in denial of our impermanence and our death. But since we're not facing these directly, we have this anxiety that we're trying to resolve, or not resolve so much, or is to avoid. And we have various, we try to reify this unreal self. We try to make a name for ourselves. We try to, measure up. We try to be somebody. And that's doomed to failure. And so it doesn't, so, we can't, but we exercise it vigorously, because as long as we're in the project of making ourselves real, we can fool ourselves about our basic unreality, which is the fact, anatta, no self. And so David Lloyd takes the anxiety of death as one example of a more fundamental anxiety of our groundlessness, our lack of an inherently subsisting self. That's the fundamental ignorance, that we're in denial of anicca and anatta. We're running from those facts of existence, impermanence and lack of an inherently existing self. And so we crave. That's tanha, the cause of suffering. We're trying to find ways to accomplish an immortality project, make a name for ourselves, leave our mark, write that book, and that craving is never quite satisfied, and we suffer. So the great matter of birth and death. Death is right here. When we're fully alive, death is right there. When we're really, really present, how did I put it in my notes? When fully alive, underlying each perception, underlying each perception, each heartbeat, each breath, death is right there. Inscrutably making life real. Death is actually supporting life. When we're really alive, death is right there, underlying each perception. It's just the flip side. It's just the other side of this one coin. When we're really alive, to be alive is to feel our mortality. If we're not feeling our mortality, we're not fully alive. If we're fully alive with each perception, with each breath, with each heartbeat, death is right there. We can't see it directly, but if we're fully alive, our living death is implicated in our living. When we're really alive, the feeling of being fully alive implies mortality, implies our death. I was thinking of it like a crescent moon. When you look at a crescent moon, and you see the illuminated part, illuminated by the sun, then you see the arc of the crescent. Now that arc of the crescent implies the unilluminated part. You get a sense of the unilluminated part when you look at the crescent of the illuminated part. When you're really, really alive, that vitality implies mortality. Living implies that living implies not quite the right word, but living implicates death. Maybe implicates might be better, Death is implicated in our living. If we're really living, death is part of that somehow. I'm grasping at words to express this, but you've probably had that feeling that vitality, death is necessary in this moment, not the future death in this moment. The fact of death is necessary for actual vitality. And in moments of vitality, mortality is present. That, the immortality projects rob us of our vitality, as y'all illustrated through those case studies. So it's difficult. I know it's difficult to actually work on this, to bring the reality of death. It's anxiety provoking. And we want to evade the anxiety. Loy, in his book, what if we were allowed the anxiety to do its work and consume the fundamental ignorance, and we realize our groundlessness? What would that be like? So I lost my train of thought for a moment, but this work is not easy. That was the train of thought. I know it's not easy to actually come to terms with the great matter of birth and death. But it's work that has value. It reveals the value of living, a fuller value of living than the fantasy of the immortality project, the denial, living in illusion. Living in reality is its own reward. Words cannot convey that reward. Everybody has to eat their own celery. You have to get there yourself. You have to live a life that embraces the fullness of the great matter yourself to realize that this difficult work is worthwhile, is liberating, although it's anxiety provoking. Death? Oh man, let's talk about something else, please. You've gone on long enough about death. Look at the skull. This is going to be you. Zen is pretty insistent on coming to terms with mortality. But death supports life. That's another koan for you. We've got two koans. Flowers do not bloom in spring. Flowers blooming are themselves spring. That's a good one. I wish I could claim that I made it up. No, it's Dogen. If you really work on that, with your body, with the fullness of your being, not just with your thought. Your thought will be confounded by it, but your way of perceiving can open if you really, really consume it, let it get stuck in your throat for a while and then get it down. Flowers do not bloom in spring. Flowers blooming are themselves spring. The other one is that life is our friend. Death. Pardon me, death is our friend. Death is our ally for the fullness of living. Turn death into an ally. It is already, so receive it as an ally for actually living your life. The 10,000 things, Lao Tzu says in the Tao Te Ching, the 10,000 things are born of being. Being is born of non-being. You can't have being without non-being. They're the yin and the yang. Or yang is a better pronunciation. The yin and the yang. Yin, the gentle loveliness and light of life, the white, is supported by the yang, the insistent presence of mortality. They dance with each other. They support one another. Death is not an enemy, an adversary. If we are earnest about the great matter of birth and death, well, half of that equation is death. Death is our ally. Death is our friend. Well, I wish I could say that I'm done talking about death, but no, I'm not. I got more to say about death. Oh, and a little aside, I discovered something really cool that, if you see something online that you want to email to yourself to use later, if you open up the reader version, up there, they have a reader version, click on that, email that. Then when you go to your emails and you open up the email, the full reader version is right there in the body of the email. You don't have to click on a hypertext and then go, it's just pops right there. So this is Mary Oliver. And the title of this poem is When Death Comes. She probably didn't say it that way. When Death Comes. That's the title of the poem. When death comes, like the hungry bear in autumn. When death comes and takes all the bright coins from his purse to buy me and snaps the purse shut. When death comes like the measles pox. When death comes, well, she's really stuck on this death thing, isn't she? When death comes like an iceberg between the shoulder blades, I want to step through that door full of curiosity, wondering what's it going to be like, that cottage of darkness. So that's only half of the poem. I want to review that. When death comes, like the hungry bear in autumn, death is always going to be anxiety provoking, folks, I think, from my limited experience, but that anxiety can be creative. Okay, when death comes like a hungry bear in autumn, when death comes and takes all the bright coins from his purse to buy me and snaps the purse shut, when death comes like the measles pox, when death comes like an iceberg between the shoulder blades, I want to step through the door full of curiosity, wondering what's it going to be like, that cottage of darkness. So, curiosity, it's inevitable anyway. Isn't curiosity, anxiety can, be curious about the anxiety instead of, trying to deny it, evade it. What's it going to be like, that cottage of darkness? So, in the second half of the poem, she presents the consequence of this curiosity, of taking seriously the great matter of birth and death. She doesn't resolve the curiosity, but she doesn't have an answer to the question. That undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns puzzles the will. Zen doesn't offer the answer. And she doesn't offer the answer. What's it like? What's it going to be like, that cottage of darkness? I want to step through that door full of curiosity, wondering what's it going to be like, that cottage of darkness. So this creative anxiety leads to this. And therefore, I look upon everything as a brotherhood and sisterhood. And I look upon time as no more than an idea. And I consider eternity as another possibility. And I think of each life as a flower, as common as a daisy, and as singular. And each name a comfortable music in the mouth, tending as all music does towards silence. And each body a lion of courage and something precious to the earth. When it's over, I want to say, all my life, I was a bride, married to amazement. I was the bridegroom, taking the world into my arms. When it's over, I don't want to wonder if I have made something of my life something particular and real. I don't want to find myself sighing and frightened or full of argument. I don't want to end up simply having visited this world. So, you want to live your life and actually arrive here, not just visit, but find home in the truth of this world? The truth of this world includes impermanence. The truth of this life includes death. If you want to actually realize the great matter, which means appreciate your life, working on facing the uncomfortable anxiety of the unknown, the end of life, death, is a friend, an ally, a partner, and actually being real, living a real life requires this work. I had more prepared to say tonight, but I had a suspicion that, unpacking the great matter, especially in the second half, death, might consume time or fill time. And so I'm not going to go into more tonight, but this is only half of the talk. So gently live with the reality of death for a week at least. And more will be, and then I'll save the rest of it for next week. Basically, how do I want to close tonight? I want to somehow close this for us so that we can live well for the coming week. I think, the Mary Oliver does it pretty well. The point of this talk is so that we don't end up simply having visited this world, so that we have a life that is real and true and can bear to live under that immeasurably vast blue sky. It can actually bear to live with the reality of the sun. I forget which philosopher Becker quoted, saying that we can't if that humans try to live under the actual reality of what the sun actually is, they would crumble into psychosis. And I'll look that up for you and maybe bring it back to you next week. But that's the point of this work, is to actually have the resiliency to live in this cosmos, actually live in this cosmos. But in order to actually live in this cosmos, to really be alive, we have to face the facts. And so that's what Mary Oliver is offering to us when she says, not if, but when death comes. She wants to be able to say she was a bride married to amazement. And she was the bridegroom taking the world into her arms. The actual world. The actual world. The actual world includes death. So, if you want to actually take the actual world into your arms, tune back in next week. Thank you very much.